storytelling and media relations skills to help create safer and friendlier streets and a healthier, more sustainable world. Welcome to all of you. We have participants from across North America, and I believe we even have someone joining us from New Zealand. In these challenging times, I hope you're all safe and well. One quick bit of housekeeping as we begin. We recommend that you use earbuds or headphones if your computer speakers aren't the best. To get us going, I want to tell you how I came to understand the value of storytelling as an advocacy tool. From 2007 to 2012, I served as communications director for the California Bicycle Coalition before becoming executive director of Sacramento Area Bicycle Advocates, a position I held for 6 years. Over this time, Melissa and I became good friends and started a long-running conversation about storytelling. I have a degree in English literature from UC Berkeley and a lifelong love of compelling narratives, but as an advocate, I could never quite get my head around exactly how storytelling served my work. I understood the importance of putting a human face on our issues, but I couldn't tell you exactly why, and I wasn't always sure how to do it. And then I saw a TEDx talk given by Swedish corporate trainer and author David J.P. Phillips about storytelling and neuroscience. He explained how storytelling causes our brains to release dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. When we hear stories, these hormones are released. They're associated with relaxation, attentiveness, motivation, generosity, trust, and empathy. These hormones are released as we listen to the story. It happens automatically. And my mind was blown. As an advocate, that's exactly what I want to see happen. I want my audience to relax, pay attention, trust and empathize with what I'm presenting, and feel motivated and generous. And now I understood that stories make that happen. Storytelling was the superpower I didn't know I needed. That's what we're here to talk about today, how we as advocates for safer streets can tell the right stories to change hearts and minds. Looks like we're having a little bit of an audio difficulty right now. Give us 1 second to sort that out.
Hey, this is Melissa. Better? We good now? Here we go. So yes, hi. I'm Melissa, the founder of Petal Love. Sorry about that little glip. And I'm excited you're here, and I'm excited that you're interested in learning more about storytelling. When I first started Petal Love in September of 2011, it was called Women on Bikes SoCal, and the whole idea behind it was that I could use my writing and media relations skills to help elevate the voice and impact of talented women I thought were being overlooked. And while I'm proud of what we accomplished in those first few years, I eventually realized that I was giving the women a fish rather than teaching them how to fish. Being featured on Petal Love in an interview, or being interviewed for a larger media outlet that I had pitched and placed for these women, or being involved in a photo shoot that I had organized for these women, photos that became so popular, organizations like the League of American Bicyclists and others wanted to use the photos of those women to promote their own events, wasn't really doing these women any favors. It wasn't helping them feel that they could tell their own stories to larger and growing audiences. So I changed my strategy. I switched from mostly promoting to mostly teaching, and from interviewing women to asking them to write their own stories. And when possible, I asked them to join me on the stage when I was invited to present at events, conferences, and summits. This is Kelly Morris, and you've probably seen this photo. It's from one of those photo sessions that I set up. She's one of the 12 women that way back in 2012, we gave a scholarship to become a bike education instructor with the League of American Bicyclists. And Kelly quickly became a favorite throughout Southern California teaching bike education. And I learned that Kelly is a marvelous storyteller as well. So I asked her to join me in creating things like the Bike Talk podcast that we did for about a year together, the Women Bike Summit about 5 or 6 years ago in Los Angeles, and for the Bicycle Tourism Conference in San Diego. When I came up with the idea to host a storytelling plenary to open up the League of American Bicyclists Summit 3 years ago, I invited 6 women to join me on stage, and many of them were quite well known, like Barb Chamberlain. But I also included Monica Garrison, the founder of Black Girls Do Bike, because I knew that Monica needed to be on the stage to tell her amazing story of creating a network of 85 chapters of women bike clubs around the United States and Antigua, thousands of members, and an annual summit so popular that now Trek sponsors it. Monica is someone who will be keynoting at summits as soon as we can meet together in person again. But 3 years ago, she wasn't on enough bike advocates' radars. To make our streets safe and comfortable for everyone, we need to do a much better job of both sharing the stories of people of color and inviting them to tell their stories directly themselves. So, what we're going to cover today is why storytelling is a superpower as a tool for advocating for safe streets. How to use the hero's journey story archetype to map out your own stories and make them much more compelling, and to teach others to do the same. And how to recognize and share the right stories in the right place from diverse audiences. And right here, I want to give a little shout out to East Coast Greenways on Twitter for doing such a great job at personal, engaging storytelling. And yes, absolutely, we'll have time for your questions at the end. If you look at the top toolbar across your AnyMeeting screen, you'll see this little icon about 5 in from the left. If you click on it, you'll see that you can submit your questions as they occur to you, and then we'll answer them in the order that we receive them, but we don't want you to forget them. So the story of Unsafe Streets is ultimately the story of people. People who rely on walking, biking, or transit, including children, seniors, people with physical impairments, and people without access to cars at all. Families and neighborhoods without any access to open space, so the streets are where kids play. Business owners that could be serving people who bike and walk. Drivers who want to bike and walk and take transit, but don't feel safe enough. Everyone has a stake. Unsafe streets discourage people and keep them in their cars. We know that transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and light vehicles, cars, and especially SUVs, account for most of it. Unless we can enable many more people to safely choose walking, biking, and transit instead of driving, we can't avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And the COVID crisis is giving us such a teachable moment about the need to create open streets, safe streets for biking and walking. So let's talk about how storytelling actually fits into your own work. You have your own reasons for doing this work that you're doing and caring as much as you do. Understanding your own personal stories helps to keep you inspired, and it inspires others. Understanding what makes a strong story and how to create one will help you recruit and train other storytellers. And using stories effectively makes your organization stronger, and strong organizations have the biggest impact. When we think about the civil rights movement, we often think about individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. But their stories are connected with much larger movements. They didn't accomplish what they did all by themselves. If we're going to meet the challenge of unsafe streets and ultimately climate change, we need strong, effective organizations and movements. And for this, we need both storytelling and compelling storytellers. And now I'm turning it back to Jim.
Thanks, Melissa. Your purpose as an advocate is to change hearts and minds. As I said a few minutes ago, storytelling engages the neurological processes that control emotions and perceptions. These are the ways that our hearts and minds actually work. Hearing a story has 2 effects on the listener. First, it increases empathy. Oxytocin in particular makes us more sensitive to social cues. In many situations, these social cues motivate us to engage to help others. Second, it creates a shared experience. Researchers at Princeton University found that speakers and listeners simultaneously experience very similar brain activity during the telling of a story. They actually have a mind meld. This is sometimes called transportation. The listener is transported into the world of your story. Your story connects listeners to events they didn't experience firsthand. That's extremely useful when you're trying to influence someone to see an issue from your perspective, especially someone who may not be familiar with your issue. For example, someone who doesn't use public transit or doesn't ride a bike. For some of you, the term storytelling conjures an image like this one, delivering a dramatic personal story in front of a microphone and an audience. Or the word makes you think of bedtime stories and wedding toasts. I struggled with the word for a long time, and I encourage you not to get hung up on it. For the advocates of safer streets, the point of storytelling isn't about expressing your personal experience or personal truths, although those might be very useful, but about recognizing the value of strategically putting a human face on your cause in order to accomplish your goal. I imagine that a few of you are struggling with this concept the way I did. Which of these thoughts are you having right now? I'm very busy. I don't have the bandwidth for this. I'm a policy wonk. Communications isn't part of my skill set or job description. I don't want to mess things up by getting it wrong. I'm not 100% sure that telling stories is part of what I should be doing. I don't have my own story to tell. These are all the internal stories I struggled with as I was figuring out how to use storytelling as a tool. The concept becomes a little easier to understand if we break it down to story and telling. What do we mean by each of these terms? Let's start with this. Stories are narratives whose structures, detail, language, and delivery cause our brains to pay attention and respond. They breathe life into abstract principles and ideas by tying them to lived experience. To make this even simpler, you can define a story by what it's not. It's not purely about data. Pay attention to how you respond to these two examples. The temperature is 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the relative humidity is 40%, and visibility is unlimited. This statement contains useful data, but nothing to relate to personally and almost nothing about the person speaking. This is a report, but not really a story. Or you could say it like this. Today is a sunny summer day, and I've never felt more alive. Feel the difference? This has the same basic details about the weather, but it also provides personal and emotional context. It starts to put a human face on the data. This isn't a report, it's a story. A report is quantitative. It's facts and data, but impersonal. A story is qualitative. It delivers data along with feeling and meaning. By being personal, it's more relatable, and I'd argue has a stronger impact. What I'm saying here isn't meant to imply that facts don't matter. Facts and data are critical. I'm just saying that how the facts get delivered makes all the difference in how they're received. For advocates, stories tell decision makers why the facts matter. So what do we mean by telling? Again, storytelling may conjure images of a stage and a mic, a room full of wedding guests, or faces around a campfire. The common thread they all share is that there's a teller and a listener. For our purposes as advocates, telling simply means all the ways a story can be shared with an audience. In a news interview, in testimony before the city council, in a presentation or training, through social media, on your website, through your newsletter, or in a fundraising appeal. Again, stories aren't just reports of data, but also reflect a human experience and have a human face. Telling is any of the ways that a story is shared with an audience. Back to you, Melissa.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to talk about the hero's journey and delve into how you can take your own story or the story of a colleague or a client or those you serve and make it truly compelling by understanding and using the hero's journey story arc or shape. The hero's journey is so predominant, it's 5 of the 7 classic storytelling arcs throughout history around the world of all time. And Here are 5 of those 5, along with classic and modern stories that have used them to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So the first one is Overcoming the Monster, which the Harry Potter series is in Overcoming Voldemort. Rags to Riches is Cinderella, the girl who had to work as a maid in her own home and then becomes the princess. The Quest is just about any Star Trek movie or television. Voyage and Return is The Hobbit. And 5th is Rebirth, Beauty and the Beast, or The Firebird comes to mind. So the hero's journey is a story, and stories always have shape, often like a triangle. And they always, this is crucial, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So why is this structure so important? Because again, as Jim pointed out, our brains are wired for stories. And it turns out, in order for us to find stories interesting and satisfying, they need to have a similar sort of structure. So the hero's journey always follows a certain pattern, including these 5 elements. It starts with exposition, which sets the scene. There's a happy normal that's just about to get upended, or there's a terrible normal that's just about to have a straw break the camel's back, such as the terrible way that Black people are often treated by the police. Next, we have the rising action, or an inciting incident that sets the hero off on a journey of transformation. This is your hook to catch your audience's attention. This is where your drama really begins. And that's what we're seeing now with, unfortunately, the death of George Floyd and so many others, and the rising, growing protests around the world. The climax is the turning point, and it does 3 things. It's the height of the story's action, it answers the story's biggest questions, and it marks the beginning of the story's descent into resolution. Right now, we feel like we're in one big climax with the protests going on around the world, and especially in the United States. Yes, police officers are being fired and arrested, but will these protests mean a change in our leadership in November? More to be revealed, right? 4th, you have falling action. At least one or more twists or turns or surprises happen. Let's put this in terms of something for active mobility. Say you've been working on having a separated bike lane put in your city because of, let's say, some really dangerous accidents that happen in an area near a school. Finally, you get a city council to say yes, but something happens to delay the creation of the lane, say a budget crisis or a lawsuit. I'm sure you can insert something else here. This falling action is when the hero has aha moments and begins to see the world differently, and when new allies show up to push things forward to resolution, like helping you get that lawsuit taken care of and the bike lanes done. The resolution is where you wrap things up with a bow for now. In the Wizard of Oz movie, Dorothy and Toto make it home, and they do in the book too, but the book is a part of a series where they go on to many more adventures. You may realize after that first bike lane, or you already knew it, that now what your city needs is a network of them. Note, without the struggle and overcoming part in this journey, it isn't really a hero's journey. Just like without kryptonite, there's no Superman. Helping you share really honestly your struggling and overcoming are crucial to making your story interesting and compelling to other people. So let's take a look at the hero's journey structure through a real-life story of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. The story arc that we're going to look at this through is overcoming the monster, and in this case, the monster is racist bus laws. The exposition is that on December 1st, 1955, 42-year-old department store seamstress Rosa Parks rode a bus home from work in Montgomery, Alabama. The bus is full, and 4 Black passengers, including Rosa, are told they must give up their seats to whites. But Rosa is tired of this unfair law and refuses. She's had run-ins with this particular bus driver before, and frankly, she's done. The part of the story that's often left out, as it certainly was for me as a child growing up, is that Rosa is the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. Next, we have the rising action, the inciting incident. Rosa's arrested, and upon her arrest, Rosa calls Edie Nixon, a prominent Black leader of her local NAACP, who bails her out of jail and determines that she would be the perfect plaintiff as a legal challenge for the segregation ordinance. The chapter president had hoped for years to find a courageous Black person of unquestioned honesty and integrity to become a plaintiff in a case that might test the validity of the segregation laws. The NAACP chapter leaders convince Rosa to file suit. She's given a court date of just 4 days later, December 5th. The climax is that Joanne Robinson, a local college English teacher and the president of the local Black women's advocacy organization, Women's Political Council, finds out about Rosa's arrest and crafts a flyer calling for a bus boycott. Her organization distributes more than 50,000 flyers in 24 hours calling for the bus boycott. As news of the boycott spreads, African American leaders around Montgomery begin lending their support. Black ministers announce the boycott in church on Sunday, December 4th, and a local paper shares a front-page article on the planned action. On the date of Rosa's court appearance, 40,000 Black bus passengers in Montgomery, the majority of the system's ridership, stop riding the bus and get around by walking, biking, carpooling, and using private Black-operated taxis that charge the people only a dime that it would cost them to take the bus. Rosa is found guilty and charged $4. Her attorney files an appeal. At the same time, the NAACP also files a federal case for 4 other Black women in Montgomery who have been arrested for not giving up their seats to whites. Originally, it was 5, but one woman drops out because of a death threat. The falling action is the afternoon after Rosa's court appearance. Black leaders gather together to form the Montgomery Improvement Association. The group elects a young 26-year-old pastor new to town named Martin Luther King Jr. as its president, and they decide to continue the boycott until the city meets their demand. The boycott lasts 381 days, over a year, and after it, the white bus company, was on the verge of bankruptcy. It had lost $300,000 in dimes. In the end, Rosa's local appeal loses, but the federal court case of Browder versus Gale succeeds and requires Alabama to desegregate its bus system. The women that were in that case are Aurelia Brown, who was 37 at the time, Susie McDonald, who was 77 at the time, Claudette Colvin, who was 16, Marie Louise Smith, who was 19, and for too long, their names and faces have not been brought to light. From this experience, we know that Dr. King emerges as the national leader on behalf of nonviolent resistance, and the social justice movement is born. So 3 takeaways from the hero's journey is that the hero's journey story is a personal story of Rosa Parks, is inherently compelling. And what made it powerful as an advocacy tool, though, was how it was used strategically as part of a larger movement. And you can do this too. Not all stories are right for the job. Rosa Parks wasn't the first or only person arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, but the local NAACP attorneys recognized that she made a great plaintiff. And there isn't just one hero's journey. Sometimes they nest within each other, or they come together as a puzzle. Rosa Parks' personal hero's journey nested within the hero's journey of the Montgomery bus boycott, launching it to begin the civil rights movement. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Jim.
Thanks, Melissa. So what this story demonstrates is that storytelling isn't an optional magic sauce that you'd add. I'd argue that the stories you tell reflect what you stand for. In that respect, storytelling isn't really separate from advocacy. And in fact, storytelling has always been used by advocates of all kinds. Most of us are familiar with stories used by advocates for disease prevention and research, such as for the March of Dimes and breast cancer awareness. Black Lives Matter has become a worldwide phenomenon precisely by telling the stories of people harmed by anti-Black racism and police violence. Personal stories have the same role in the Me Too movement. Environmental justice movements like the Dakota pipeline protests are all about human stories and human impacts. Movements for roadway safety and safer streets have been built around human stories too. Candy Lightner on the left founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving in 1980 after her 13-year-old daughter was killed by a drunk driver near their home in suburban Sacramento. She told the stories of her daughter's death and her own devastation as the way to raise awareness about the need to change laws related to alcohol and driving. Vision Zero and Families for Safe Streets campaigns are doing something similar at the local level. And then there are the negative examples of compelling storytelling. In the 1920s, as cities saw car traffic and driving-related injuries and deaths on their streets, there were calls to ban cars from cities. The auto industry responded with an advocacy push built around stories that presented cars and driving as symbols of opportunity, freedom, power, and status, and redefined our public streets as places primarily for cars and driving. These continue to be stories told by the auto industry, and we could spend all day talking about the impacts. I highly recommend the book Fighting Traffic by Peter Norton to learn more. It's a fascinating history and well worth your time. What all these movements have in common is that the stories they use are chosen to serve a specific goal and influence a specific audience. In our work, we start to find these stories by knowing what we want to accomplish and the person or group we need to influence in order to make that happen. Here's a way to think about this. What is the specific problem to be solved or the specific change to be made? It could be the installation of a traffic signal or adoption of a roadway improvement plan. What group or community would benefit most from this solution or change? This could be kids attending a nearby elementary school or low-income service workers trying to access public transit. Who do they need to influence in order to achieve your safe? Who do you need to influence in order to achieve your safe streets goals, and what exactly do you need them to do? It could be getting a majority of your city council to vote yes on a project or a plan, or it could be getting donors to provide financial support for your Safe Streets campaign. Finally, who do those people listen to, and what group or community can they not afford to ignore? This might not be you personally, but the people who would benefit directly from the proposed solution. Knowing your goal and your audience will tell you what kinds of stories will be most effective. In other words, whose stories best represent the problem or reason for the needed change, and whose stories are likeliest to touch your intended audience. To get a city council majority to vote yes, it might be stories about or told by constituents. The answers will show you how you'll tell that story. It might be in a fact sheet you send to city council members, in testimony you give at a city council hearing, or in a social media post with a call to action for your supporters. To give you a concrete example, I want to walk you through the way that we developed and used stories for Calbike's first campaign to enact a 3-foot passing law in California. In 1980, June 2010, Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa was riding his bike in LA when a taxi cab cut him off. He fell in the street and shattered his elbow. That's him on the left side of the sign. Within a few weeks, he hosted a town hall meeting about bicycling in unsafe streets, and then his staff called us at Calbike to say that he wanted to partner with us on legislation to enact a 3-foot passing law in California. We were already aware of similar laws in other states and an earlier failed effort to enact one in California, and we weren't convinced we could overcome the opposition a second time. But we had the mayor of the nation's second largest city ready to be the face of the issue and ready to use his enormous political capital. He was literally giving us the story we needed. So we said yes. By early the following year, the bill had been introduced in the state capitol and hearings began. Our specific goal was to amend the California Vehicle Code to specify 3 feet as the minimum clearance that drivers needed to give people on bikes when passing them from behind. To get the law enacted, we'd need yes votes from a majority of the legislators sitting on the Transportation and Fiscal Committees in both the Senate and the Assembly, and a majority of legislators in both houses. Then we need the governor to sign the bill into law. These were our main audiences. Another important audience was the constituents of those legislators and the governor and the constituents that the governor would listen to. So we needed to influence the voters. To reach those audiences, we needed to raise the issue of passing distances among legislators who weren't familiar with it and overcome indifference and hostility to people on bikes among many of them. Having the mayor's story made the issue much more relatable, and yet he was a Latino Democrat from Southern California and a political rival to some in the legislature, and therefore his story wouldn't reach everyone we needed to reach. So we wanted to show the faces of ordinary people that individual legislators were likely to know about, specifically people from their districts. We focused on the stories of people killed or injured in hit from behind collisions in the districts of the legislators on the Senate and Assembly Transportation Committees. If a majority of them supported the bill, it was likely that we were going to get a majority of both houses to go along. To find our stories, we started by determining who was likeliest to support the bill. Again, this was our main audience. Then we compiled brief profiles of collision victims based on news stories and information we solicited from local bike advocacy organizations. Again, we focused on stories of people from the districts of legislators who were likeliest to vote yes on our bill. We were very surgical and strategic about this. Meanwhile, we also asked our constituents to tell us their stories of surviving or witnessing a hit from behind collision or a near miss. And as the bill got going, we even heard from legislators who recounted their own experiences of being grazed by passing cars while riding their bikes. We created a digital handout with the victim profiles, which we emailed to each legislator along with our request to vote yes on the bill. We named some of those victims when we testified at the Capitol. We also posted the stories on our website, which we could link back to, and shared the stories publicly in social media and our e-newsletter, and in targeted direct mail appeals to legislators, constituents, and supporters. Again, we were very focused on this one particular audience. Finally, I kept some of the most dramatic stories in my back pocket for when I would get calls from the news media for interviews about the bill. And in asking people to contact their legislators on behalf of the bill, we encourage them to share their stories directly with their lawmakers. The result was that the bill was approved by the legislature, but ultimately vetoed by the governor. And this is what often happens with legislation. The first time you introduce a bill, you're getting people's attention and starting the conversation. And that's exactly what our story-driven strategy did. It took 2 more attempts to enact the 3-foot law in California. The 3rd try was successful. And now it's back to Melissa.
Okay, thank you. Jim? Because, okay, so sorry about that. I'm making some challenges for myself here. So let's talk about putting this all together and how this relates to you. These are some next steps concrete next steps that you can start taking now to put storytelling for safer streets into play for you and your organization. We'll be sending you a downloadable worksheet, not only on mapping out your own stories, but some of the key points that Jim has been making about the right story for the right place. And so you'll be able to map out a hero's journey yourself and teach others how to do it. Plus, of course, we'll be sharing the recording of this, and that will both will be to you by early next week. In the meantime, as you're thinking about it, jot down ideas for stories as they occur to you so that you don't lose them. So, using the hero's journey template, write your own story of unsafe streets in 5 paragraphs, one for each of the phases of the hero's journey template. And this piece can be used in the future for a blog, a newsletter, or you can tell it in a conversation as a 2 or 3 minute or less story. It's important for you to get your hands in the clay and test it out. Even if you never find that your own personal story is really right to share for your organization about unsafe streets, you need to understand how to craft these stories so that you can ask others and coach them to do the same who do have the right stories. Ask your board members, staff, and those you serve, and your most active volunteers about their personal experiences of unsafe stories and show them how to map them out to the hero's journey, and collect 3 to 5 of these 2 to 3 minute hero's journey stories that you can have at the ready. It's going to take you a little while to curate these, but as Jim pointed out, having those stories in his back pocket was really important. Choose those that are the most relevant to your work, the audiences that you most want to reach, and importantly, from the voices that have often been left out. And then get these stories ready to share in different formats about unsafe streets, again, for blogs, email newsletters, news interviews, social media, and more for the rest of the year, and especially as you get ready to fundraise. So now we would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already submitted a question in the little box here, fifth from the left at the top of your toolbar, we would love to hear your questions. And we want to know how we can bring you greater clarity for what that we have talked about today, how it can have personal relevance for what you're dealing with. So who has a question for us? Here we go. Let's see. I don't know why it's giving me a challenge, and I'm not sure why. Marilyn, I know that this is from you, and it's not showing me your question. So I'm wondering if instead we can go to the text box at the left and have you include it there, if you can go ahead and share it there. Okay, so while we wait for that, it looks like my brilliant idea of using the little question and answer box at the top is not working for right now. So let's go to the text box at the left, and that's where you can text us your questions in the attendee chat, and I'll pick them up from there. So Marilyn, if you could go ahead and text that to us, that would be great. So we've got people from around the United States and Canada and even New Zealand, and we would love to hear your specific questions. Are you sure, you guys? We were great, and we were right on time this time. In fact, we're a little bit early. So we have actually 20 minutes for questions. So let's have a little bit of a conversation. What are you dealing with right now in storytelling? Or have you not started it yet? Are you just getting ready to start it? Or have you used stories in a way? And now this gives you some ideas for how you might use them more successfully. Deb Banks from Sacramento, you want to share some thoughts with us about storytelling? Or Jonathan Weber or Rick Holt? We'd love to hear some thoughts, questions or thoughts. Okay, good ideas. Okay, so this is from Marilyn. How do we tell others stories while not appropriating their cause? I'm not disabled, but I'd like to advocate for all mobilities. So, Jim, why don't you? I'm happy to share some thoughts on that, but first, Jim, I'd like to have you share some thoughts on that if you would.
Thanks. That's a really interesting question, Marilyn. I struggled with that one myself related to bicycling. We were focused on neighborhoods of Sacramento that were underserved, that hadn't been receiving public funding for safe streets. And people in those neighborhoods were much more at risk from unsafe conditions. But I didn't live in those neighborhoods. And so I think the way to think about this is uh, you have the opportunity to tell a story. You might want to make the effort to find that story. You can work through your network, ask people for introductions to people or to share stories that they know about. The other way to do it is to invite people to tell those stories. So, for example, a disability advocacy organization would be more than happy to talk about the issues that you're interested in talking about. So, I think it's really about the about uh, making the effort to find those stories. And I can't put a too fine a point on that. I was given a position as ED that allowed me to talk to the media on a regular basis. But often I wasn't the really the best representative for the issue that I was talking about, and so it was really important to make sure that I was either pointing to other stories and not telling them as if they were my own stories, but rather pointing to other stories and, where possible, pulling others into the conversation. So those are some ways to start there.
And I'm not really going to add too much to what Jim just said, but I am going to add that this is one of the reasons why you want to think about curating these stories and collecting them now, and um, keeping your eye out on social media for people that not only the organizations like Jim talked about, but the actual people that could that might be fantastic storytellers that you didn't know about in your network, and bringing them forward. We've got another couple of really great questions. A few great questions. Thank you, guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So this is from Deb Banks in Sacramento, and she says, I think that storytelling is really important, and Jim is an expert at it. How do we tell a story that's not completed? We get to the rising action, but not yet to the climax or into the falling action. How do you keep interested in an ongoing story? So I would say to this, Deb, that you take the story where it is now and you format it as best you can to the hero's journey so that it has a resolution for now, right? It's not the end of the story. It's going to keep going. Harry Potter doesn't finally defeat Voldemort until the very end of the series, if you're familiar with it. And so it's just a resolution. It comes to some kind of resolution for right now, some decision for right now. And you'll find when you start mapping it out using the hero's journey that you can take your own story and you can twist and turn it a couple different ways and find a way to do that. So I hope that clarifies that for you. I've got
Well,
a question.
could I add something
Yeah,
to that?
absolutely.
Um, Deb, think about the 3 Foot campaign and Mayor Villaraigosa. Obviously, the one arc of that hero's journey story is ends at the passage of the law, but there's another hero's journey story, and that's his story. The exposition is that he was a mayor and he wanted to ride his bike. The rising action was that he got on his bike and got cut off by a taxi, and he fell. And the end of that arc is him calling Calbike and saying, "We need to do something." So the hero's journey arc can be adapted to big long arcs, like the multi-year arc that it took for the 3 foot passing law to get enacted, and it can be applied to very short arcs, like he was trying to ride his bike, he got cut off in traffic, he fell and broke his elbow and required surgery, and resolved to take some action and ended up working with Calbike to get a bill introduced. So I hope that kind of fleshes that out. It's a very flexible format.
Perfect. So this is one, Jim, I'm also going to want you to answer from Richard Holt, because it's something that you and I were talking about a couple days ago. So Richard's talking about he wants a smarter ways to use storytelling and trying to promote safer infrastructure for kids to bike and walk to school in the suburbs, less driving kids to school. So you have some thoughts about that, Jim, that we were talking about using kids themselves as storytellers.
Well, kids can be storytellers. The story of kids trying to get to school is a great story. Everybody has that experience, right? Every one of us has gone to school, and I'm an older guy, and I had the good fortune of being able to walk and bike to high school on a regular basis. Um, and so yes, there's a bunch of those stories. Um, it's also really important to remember that kids and families are hard to ignore and hard to minimize. And so strategically, they're very, very useful for the purposes of talking about safe streets and unsafe conditions. The other part of this is maybe some concerns about um, how you would involve a kid in telling this story. And the easy way to do this is to have the parent tell the story. I know some people focus on the legal question of whether you can use a kid's story. At least in the United States, if you have an adult's permission to use a story, then you're good to go. So really, you want to figure out who in your network or who in your constituency is talking about this already. Talk to families you know, talk to people in the neighborhood that you're working in, and start that conversation. And I think you'll start to hear a lot of people saying, "I really wish I could get my kids to school by some way other than having to drive them, but there's this one intersection or this one stretch of street that is just too hard for us to use." Those are all really useful stories.
So, and what I want to add to this, Richard, is that in this case, you don't want to just tell stories of unsafe streets. You also want to tell the stories of people that, kids that are um, riding their bikes to school and walking to school, and they are really feeling better. Maybe you could talk to teachers. And I know there's data out there that talks about how kids that bike and walk to school are feeling much better. They concentrate better, they're getting better grades. But if you can have a few stories peppered in about children and parents noticing the difference, especially if you have people that used to drive and now bike or walk their kids to school and noticing the difference. And if you're living in an area where you have a lot of different cultures, getting those translated and then making sure that those stories are being shared in a way that that particular audience actually most receives information. In the Hispanic community, it might be a radio station that you pitch a story about that. And you might have the actual parents that are biking and walking their kids to school be on the show and the child themselves. So it's you don't want to just tell stories of unsafe streets. You want to do a hero's journey of feeling better when you're dealing with kids because you want to skate to where the puck will be. You want to skate to where the new behavior is that you want to change. So you want to give people fun things to look forward to as well. We have a question from Jonathan Weber, who's having a bit of a tough time formulating his question, but here goes. What about using stories in situations where achieving the story's resolution is contingent on making the changes we're advocating for? A friend struggles to get to work by bike because of unsafe conditions. Adding protected bike lanes would allow her to ride. What's the best way to use the story when the protected bike lane is what you're advocating for? And this is where you're going to be, and I'll have Jim speak up in just a minute about it too. But yeah, actually documenting the struggle and how they're overcoming right now, but how it could be so much better. You can compare and contrast to places where people do have that ability, where those roads were made safer exactly in the same way that you want to make them safer, to show people that it can be done, and having that person say what that would mean to them. What would it save? Not only scariness issue, money, time, effort, energy, stress, all of that. So you can, while you're still in the struggle of the end, you can tell the story for right now, if that makes sense. Jim, you want to share some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think what I would add here is that the story the story that you tell is essential for communicating what you're trying to accomplish, but it may not be all of the information that a decision maker needs to be getting. So, for example, your story is really the illustration of why you need the protected bike lane, and and you can point to examples of other communities that have protected bike lanes where they've seen increased ridership, where they've seen a reduction in crashes. Um, so don't worry about trying to find the one story that tells the whole that encapsulates all of the information that you need to be conveying. The story is the face that you put on it. It's a little bit like that little anecdote I shared at the beginning about the temperature. Um, uh, you want to you want to do more than just give the data. Um, so you really want to frame the data in terms of a human experience. If you want to contact me offline, feel free to do that. We will, I don't know if they're posted on the slideshow here or not, but we'll get you our email addresses. If you'd like to do some problem solving offline, I'd be glad to help you with that.
Yeah, exactly. And so Charlotte Fleetwood asked the same question, kind of slightly different way, but I want to address it anyway. Is the hero's journey the right way to have someone say why they don't bike and what it would take for them to do so? I would say yes. Even yes, because absolutely, because there's some kind of struggle and overcoming they're dealing with right now. So it could be diabetes, it could be other health challenges, it could be cost challenges, it could be time challenges. So, absolutely, the hero's journey is the way to set them up because, again, the hero's journey isn't about winning, it's about learning and transformation, it's about the struggle and overcoming. So, even if you're still in the struggle in some way, you you can point to a better future on that. So we've got another great question here from Richard Holt. Has the opportunity to connect with a group that's focused on climate change and they understand that transport is major emitter of GHG. However, parental concern over safety of the built environment maybe get more kids involved. Share parents' memories, walking, biking to school, and stories of kids that are currently biking and walking to school, mobility, freedom, and discovery. Absolutely. This is one of the big reasons that Jim and I are doing this, and he'll share his own thoughts about this too. But we woke up to the realization that many of us did 2 years ago that the clock was ticking on climate. And we've known for years that biking, walking, and public transit were not at the table with the big guns in the environment movement, that it just was completely missing. So if you have an opportunity to engage this group and get them to recognize that every kid that can walk and bike to school, even part time, is a win, and how to tell those stories like any of us who grew up in the 60s or 70s and even part of the 80s, I am 11 years older than my brother. So I am 56, my brother is 45. I was never driven to school, and then by the time my brother came along, he was almost always driven to school because my parents were just completely overbooked their lives. So and now he has his children he lives in a neighborhood where they can walk and bike to school, which is wonderful. So you, absolutely, and you can get permissions and everything like that, and be very careful about it, and just be super clear with everybody, especially if you're going to reach out to the media, especially if you're going to use photos, exactly why you're doing it and exactly what you hope to accomplish, so that people don't think you take their stories and run away with them, or you used their stories in a way that isn't relevant. And when they get to tell their own stories, they feel really, really empowered. So Jim, you want to jump in on that one?
Well, you really covered it. I think you're talking about developing a really compelling collection of stories that everybody can relate to. Either people have memories of having walked or biked to school, or they really want to do it and they recognize that the environment doesn't let them do that. So either way, you have a very ready, willing audience. And of course, decision makers can also be asked to share their stories. So you're really opening up an opportunity for everybody to talk about what they want to achieve. We know from the four types of transportation cyclists survey that started in Portland, Oregon, and has been conducted across, I think, 50 metropolitan areas in the United States. A majority of drivers will tell you, or majority of residents will tell you that they are interested in riding a bike for everyday transportation, but they don't feel safe on the roads. These are people who are continuing to drive, not because they love driving, but because they don't feel safe. So I think we underestimate the power of that topic, and it's going to take a big, heavy lift to get the full attention of decision makers. But the kinds of stories that you're talking about are absolutely compelling and really make it hard to ignore this issue.
So if you want to connect with us, Richard, about that, please do. I'm gonna share our email addresses in just a minute, but we're gonna answer one more question here from Gerald White. And he says, I'm thinking about a story that I often tell, and I want to put it in a hero's story format. At a very pedestrian, unfriendly intersections, four kids crossing the street in front of their school were literally run over by a car making a right turn over the crosswalk. A bunch of burly guys stopped and came over and lifted the car off the kids. We agitated for a better intersection design, but the city traffic engineer insisted that there was nothing wrong with the intersection. No changes. Seems like a story where the dragon eats the hero. Oh boy. Yeah. So here's what I would ask you, Gerald, and again, let's go back and forth on this in email. But this is where the media really can come into play to give you extra oomph and power for your audience. Certainly, you want to get the story out through the school board and the PTA and any newsletter that the school would have to address this, but really make sure that you're putting real faces about who those fabulous young people are and where their lives were and what they were hoping for. And I'm hoping they didn't die, but how that's changed their lives, right? You really want to put those faces forward in this. And this is that kind of, each one of them's a hero's journey, and together they're part of this movement that you're working on, right? To create what you want to do is get righteous action. Think about the fact that we've been turning a blind eye to how Black people are treated by the police, and all of a sudden we have it on video, people dying in front of our eyes, and we cannot look away. This is kind of a similar situation, right? And um, you you want to make sure that you get this story into the media, and it's not fresh, but it's you can use the report and our toolkit to go back to the media and say, hey, you know what? We've got proof that how the media is talking about traffic crashes for people biking and walking influences how drivers are thinking and behaving. And that's why stuff like this happens. This traffic engineer is buying into it. And those people that person that ran over the kids bought into it, and they need to wake up.
Well,
Jim, you
I'd love to add something to this. Gerald, this is a lot like the 3 foot law story. Um, Obviously, the mayor getting knocked off his bicycle and breaking his elbow, and the bill being ultimately vetoed by the governor, was a dragon eats hero story. But at the same time, it is also the beginning of another story, um, which is our effort to create a campaign to get this intersection improved. I've got an example of a really compelling video put together by an allied organization here in Sacramento about exactly the situation you're talking about. A young high school student was killed in an intersection where there wasn't a traffic signal. And this video was part of a full court press that they did to get a traffic signal installed at this intersection. I'd be glad to share it with you, and that could give you some ideas. And of course, I'm available to brainstorm with you a little bit more if that's helpful.
So we are at our time, and so I just want to quickly thank everybody for fantastic questions, but know that you can continue this conversation with us through email. We will be following up with you about this to get a survey from you and about sharing the video of this or the recording of this, and then that worksheet that we've promised everybody. I do want to point out to you guys that we've decided we're going to delve even deeper into this. And after these questions, I feel like we're really onto something. So we're going to be hosting Finding the Story, The Advocate's Journey, a two-parter. So it would be 1 hour each session, and it's going to be hands-on. It's going to be very different than these. This is more of this is really a workshop. So we're going to host that it's on a Wednesday, July 22nd or 29th, or on a Saturday. I made a typo there. So it's Wednesday, July 22nd or 23rd, or on a Saturday, August 22nd or 29th. Then we're going to have storytelling for fundraising coming up in September, and storytelling for social media coming up in October. So we'll keep you posted on all of that. And here are our emails if you don't have them already. So you can get in touch with us with any questions that you have. And again, we will be following up with you on a survey to kind of see where you want to go next and where you need the most help, because that's going to help us formulate these hands-on workshops. And the reason that we're going to have them at 2 different times is that we want to actually we're going to talk about some stuff, have you guys do some stuff, and then think about it, and then be able to come back. We're also going to be having you share what you're working on with others. So it's going to be more like a webinar where everybody's going to have a chance to talk than Jim and I being the talking heads here just for time's sake. Jim, final thoughts?
No, I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk about this. Again, I'm really interested in all of your questions. I feel like we're all on the same page about the value of stories, and now we have some work to do to figure out how we can really bring that to life. So I really appreciate your interest and your time today.
Thank you, everybody. This is a fantastic group of people. We're going to do a little recap ourselves. We'll come back in about 5 minutes for Jim and I to do a recap between ourselves. But for that 5 minutes, I'm going to leave it open in case any of you want to share your email and who you are with others to start connecting about finding storytellers, people that are interested in digging deep, because it's really important for you to have people to throw ideas around with. And if you don't have other support within your organization, or if you're working solo on this, it's really helpful to have other people that are at the same phase you are to get support from. So I'm going to leave that open for about 5 minutes. Jim and I are going to step away for a little bit before we come back and do our own internal